Hey, folks, welcome to the Michael Steele podcast. I'm excited about our conversation today because I'm going to spend a little bit of time with an old buddy of mine who was the state party chairman of Washington when I was the national chairman at the RNC. Chris Vance is a hell of a good political operative, smart tactician. He spent 37 years working in the Republican Party as a staffer, candidate, elected official, and state party chairman. The rise of Donald Trump, of course, and the historic destruction and transformation of the Reaganite Republican Party he knew has not only thrown him, but all of us into a tizzy. But he has a way out. He has a response to that. And we want to talk about that. Unfortunately, he left the party in 2017, but he's still fighting for the party today. He's now an independent, never Trump conservative, actively trying to build an alternative to our current two-party system. And he is the author of the new book, The Fall of the Shining City: What Happened to the Republican Party, Why It Happened, and What Must Happen Right Now to Save American Democracy. My conversation with Chris Vance coming up right here on the Michael Steele podcast, right after this. Hey, folks, welcome to the Michael Steele podcast. I'm so excited to have you guys be a part of the conversation today because it's going to be a great one. I get a lot from folks, what's happened to the Republican Party? Is it breaking up? Has it, imploded? Will it come back? And so I thought it was important to talk to someone who I had the pleasure of working with when he was the chairman of the state party in Washington, and I was at the RNC, and going back to even when I was a state party chairman here in Maryland, and someone who knows, and someone who's written, I think, an important book to help put into context, not just what's happened to the party, but what the fight at hand is really about and what it needs to look like in order for us to begin to answer the question, will the Republican Party emerge on the other side of Trumpism? That's why it's such a pleasure to welcome former state party chair and all-around good man, Chris Vance. Welcome, brother.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me. It is a great honor. And yeah, you and I used to have lunch together and lament the fact that state party chairman did all the work while the national committee people got,
So we did.
Yes.
We did. We would sit there and go, these people strut around and all they're supposed to do is raise money and they don't do that.
Right. And state party chairmen work hard.
Work very hard.
It is a difficult job.
It is a very difficult job. It requires a lot of glue and toothpicks and lipstick just to kind of keep it all together and try to win elections. And look, I tell people all the time, my job, whether I was a county chairman, a state chairman, or national chairman, was two things: raise money and win elections.
Yeah.
That was it. Was not complicated. The challenge that you don't talk about, though, is everything that you have to do to win those elections and raise that money.
And the care and feeding of your local volunteers and your local county. There was an afternoon I'll never forget. I was on the phone with the deputy White House political director about something important. And the next call was from a county chairman from a tiny county in Eastern Washington who needed $100 to rent a booth for their county fair and didn't have it. And was hoping the state party would cover it. I mean, you're dealing with the volunteers all the way up to the most sophisticated professionals in politics.
Which is why the book you've written, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on to talk about the fall of the shining city. Reagan referred to America as that shining city on a hill. You've written a book, The Fall of the Shining City: What Happened to the Republican Party, Why It Happened, and What Must Happen Now to Save American Democracy. Is your way, it's when you read it, and when I read it, it's almost, it's like you're putting it out here. You're just saying, just take a look at the mess, take a look at the problem, and take a look at these solutions in order for us to get on the other side of this. Walk us through your thinking about the book, what the premise is, what you're trying to get people to understand about essentially the fall of the Republican Party as it sort of sets up a potential fall for the country.
Yeah, I hope it sells. It's available on Amazon. I hope it sells 1 million copies. But I never thought I'd be a author. I never thought I'd write a book. I taught some graduate school at the University of Washington, but I'm not an academic. I'm a politician, but I've lived my life in the Republican Party. I mean, my first job out of college was working as a young Republican staff person in the state capitol in Olympia, and I worked in the Republican Party my whole life up until 2016. And I just felt compelled to share the truth about what happened to the party, why it happened, and what we've got to do, because so many people get this wrong. There's a mountain of books written about this, but they're mostly written either by liberals who've always hated the Republican Party, like Heather Cox Richardson, or insiders like Stuart Stevens, who just want to make money off of it. Not that I don't like, it's not that I don't like Stuart Stevens, but it was not all a lie, which is what his book is.
Right.
And so I wanted to lay out what I saw from the inside as the party fell apart, and then why that happened. And people don't talk enough about that, Michael.
Right.
Don't talk about why it happened, and then what I think we need to do now. And so it's not my autobiography, but I have to place myself in the story. So the first maybe half of it is detailing what I saw as I went from a young staff person to a state legislator to a member of the King County Council. King County is Seattle and all its major suburbs, huge county, and then as state party chairman. And I make the case that, in my opinion, the party really started to fall apart around 2007 with the rise of the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus and that sort of thing, and then go into why.
Right.
And the big reason why it wasn't the fault of Fox News or Tucker Carlson or Rush Limbaugh or Facebook, although those things all played a role. Things in politics happen for actual reasons that affect real people.
Yeah.
I ran for the U.S. Senate in 2016, and I saw the whole Trump thing up close and personal. And during that campaign, people would come up to me and say, mostly older white voters, Chris, this just doesn't feel like my country anymore.
Right.
And they were right. It isn't. It isn't. I mean, I'm 61 years old, about to turn 62. When I was born, America was 90% white and 90% Christian. When Reagan got elected, it was 80% white and 90% Christian. The country has diversified massively, dramatically, where the white population is now under 60, and so is the percentage of Americans who call themselves Christians. And this diversity disrupted our culture, and people react to it. And that is normal, I mean, you see things on TV my father would never have imagined he'd ever see on TV,
Right.
And a lot of older white voters, working class voters, just don't like that. And then of course, in the old days, we Republican leaders, I'm sure you had to do this. You had to stand up in front of the crowds and say, no, calm down. It's not true. There was the famous case at the town hall meeting where the woman talked about how John McCain
Right.
Obama is a Muslim, and McCain's like, no. Well, Trump and Tucker Carlson and Pat Robertson and Pat Buchanan, instead of saying no, they throw gasoline on the fire.
Right.
And they've given people permission to react to this cultural change, and that's what's taken the party down.
So what did you see in that early journey? I know for me, it was very different than it would be for you. I grew up in Washington, D.C. So it's a very different landscape politically, where from the very beginning, I had to make the conscious decision to join a party that was coming off of its relationship with civil rights and coming off of its relationship with African Americans, because Reagan Reagan appealed to me in a way that I saw reflected in how my mother raised me and taught me values about taking responsibility and despite the ugliness that she grew up in, and that I even experienced as a young kid, it's still in DC, that this country was great, that there was something good about the country and something of value to it. What did you see growing up that helped shape that idea of the Republican Party, its positioned politically in a you know, a duopoly, a two-party system that resonated with you, and then the change?
Yeah. So I am the ultimate 70s, 80s suburban, kid. Grew up in an upper middle class family. My dad managed a car dealership. My mom was a school secretary. We weren't rich, but we
Right.
had plenty of money, and my summers were golf lessons and basketball camp and water skiing and in Bellevue, Washington, which is suburban east of the upper middle class suburb east of Seattle. And my dad was in business, and my parents were World War II generation who believed that America was the greatest place on earth. And I think but they weren't political. Neither one of them were active in either political party. But this was the era of Carter and the British Labour Party going so far to the left. And as I became a young teenager and started to become culturally aware of anything, it was that the economy was terrible. We were experiencing stagflation. Government was getting bigger. And more than anything else, Michael, it was fear of nuclear war. I tell my kids, my whole generation grew up scared to death watching movies like The Day After,
Right.
And I believed the basic message that American weakness, allowing the Soviets to have such a massive conventional advantage in Western Europe, was going to lead to World War III, and that weakness invites aggression. And so I looked around as I started getting ready to go to college, and one party was talking, Ronald Reagan was talking about peace through strength and growing the economy, not growing the government. Basic messages. And this is important. Back then and throughout most of my career, the Republican Party was dedicated to two issues: keeping the peace by being strong and growing the economy, a rising tide lifting all boats.
Right.
Yeah, we would talk about abortion, but we never really wanted to focus on that. I mean, that's not and we certainly never talked about immigration or all these culture war issues that are today. It was completely different. And it stayed that way for a very long time. I mean, throughout the 1980s,
Right.
the 1990s, you had people like Pat Buchanan came up and tried to take over the party, and he failed. I make a big point that critics love to talk about all these terrible people who represented, but they never ran the Republican Party.
Right.
In the 1960s, the Republican Party was led by Richard Nixon, who was a villain who should have gone to prison for obstruction of justice, but he was a very moderate Republican.
Yeah.
And the party remained pretty true to the Reaganite principles up until around the late in George W. Bush's first term, which is, again, when I think the demographic changes and cultural changes started to take hold. Here in my state, the Democrats are always the majority, but we were a very viable minority. We elected governors, we elected attorneys general, we elected my hero, Slade Gorton, to the U.S. Senate over and over again. We would get majorities in the state legislature. It was moderate Republicans, and we successfully, stopped the far right from taking over the party multiple times. It's amazing today. It's amazing today. The far right in my state hates me more than anyone else. Well, the grassroots elected me chairman 3 times.
Right. Yeah.
That's how much it's changed.
Yeah, that is a very good point, because I look at the crap I have to deal with here in Maryland. I just don't even deal with it anymore. Actually, I just kind of let it fester in its own cauldron of stupid. But the reality of it is, people that you worked alongside of and were very supportive of you, at times would defend you against the crazies, right? Are now themselves the crazies that come after you and attack you because you're a rhino and you're suddenly all these things that you weren't, but because they have devolved into MAGA and Trumpism, everything else to justify their thinking and their attitude shift. They don't look at their own movement. They think that you've changed because you didn't agree with, not draining the swamp. They just sucked that sucker down. That it was a different swamp. They just drunk that Trump swamp water like crazy. and we were the bad guys. You noted it. You noted in your book about this idea about the threat, and the under the part where you talk about why it happened, and you say the greatest threats to freedom and liberal democracy came from the left, from Soviet Union and Marxism, Leninism.
Yep. Yep.
That threat was the single biggest reason why I became a Reagan Republican. I did not believe liberals in Europe or the Democratic Party here at home took the danger seriously enough.
Yep.
What is that still the case, or has that changed? Because now today I see the Democrats much more in defense of NATO and Europe and the alliance, and
Yes.
and
It's
the
totally,
Republicans are the one that
changed.
like blow it all up.
It's totally changed on both sides of the Atlantic. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a seminal moment which convinced the French and the Germans, especially the French and the Germans, but the rest of Europe, that Putin is a fascist who wants to reconstitute the Russian Empire and is going to keep invading his neighbors until someone stops him. The Democrats have come to that conclusion. They realize that. They also see the threat from China and the South China Sea. But the Republican Party under Trump has reverted to the isolationism of the 1920s. I mean, it's like Coolidge is president again, or Hoover.
Right.
And part of it, of course, is just Trump says it. I mean, whatever they're like, whatever he says, they just accept. And he thinks everything is transactional and about money. And because some of our NATO allies have not met the goal of putting 2% of their GDP into NATO, they haven't paid. And we're not going to defend them if they haven't paid.
Right.
I think that at heart, though, he's just an isolationist. He took out full-page ads back in the old days criticizing Reagan for standing up. Of course, the darkest view is he's a Soviet asset who is controlled by.
I tend to fall more into that camp. I mean, just my study of history, the work I've done in the international space over 30 years, the people who practice in that area, from national security to CIA types that you talk to, he fits the classic definition of an asset on so many levels. And I know that may be inflammatory to some, but you know what? I don't give a damn, because I just look at what the man is saying and doing when it comes to Vladimir Putin and Russia, and the fact that the party has moved 180 degrees off of where Reagan stood in defining the evil empire, identifying where the menace in the world was, to now embracing that menace, and in fact doing everything to perpetuate it. I think that gives me a good basis on which to make that judgment.
In the 1930s, the world seemed to face a choice. We're either going to be fascists or communists. And democracy seemed to be failing. And both were evil. Fascism on the right, socialism, communism on the left. And eventually, the real threat became, from the fascists and the Nazis. But we thought fascism was dead and gone. It's back.
Right.
In all the Western democracies, the threat now is from the far right, from the racist, nationalist, fascist far right. And people don't want to call Trump a fascist, but he's darn close if he's not a full-on fascist. And so I say, the threats now come from the right. And isolationism is the most dangerous thing of all time, because Putin believes Trump, I think. If Donald Trump is the next president, Putin is going to move against the Balkans, against Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, and then we're at war, whether Trump likes it or not, because the Europeans aren't going to sit by, and a war with nuclear weapons. I mean, the greatest danger of Trump is World War III.
It is the thing that makes you wonder why more folks don't get that part of it. And the fact of the matter is, what's happened in large measure, Chris, is that the focus has been on the culture war aspect of this. You note in the book, MAGA Republicans believe they are fighting to defend America itself, America based on Bible and traditional American patriotism. And so every issue becomes part of the culture war. Legalized abortion and same-sex marriage, athletes kneeling during the national anthem, increased immigration, gun control, talk of democratic socialism and institutional racism, even how we greet each other during the holidays. These are not just issues to be debated, but existential threats to, quote, America. And so to cultural conservatives, the preservation of this America is more important than the democratic process, I would say, than the democracy itself.
Yep.
Your book goes on and details the deconstruction of the party alongside of all of this. And you note that it began late in the George W. Bush presidency.
Yep.
Connect those dots. What drove that? How does that period in the Bush second term get us to what I just described today?
Immigration lit the match. Republican Party had always supported, as far back as I was involved, comprehensive immigration reform, which meant real border security, but with a path to legality for those already here. Amnesty, as people say. Ronald Reagan gave amnesty to all long-term immigrants who were already here.
Yeah.
That had always been the Republican Party's position. In 2006, 2007, President Bush sent to Congress a comprehensive immigration reform bill to do that. Border security plus a path to legality for those already here. Again, it had been Republican dogma for a long time, supported by the business community, by groups like the Heritage Foundation, Cato particularly, the farm groups who need immigrant labor, all the traditional Republican groups. And to the shock of everyone, the conservatives in the House, particularly what became the Freedom Caucus, rose up and killed it. And it was at the urging of Rush Limbaugh and talk radio and their conservative base, who were basically, all of a sudden immigration was bad. Because you let brown people come in and take over our culture. And I was shocked at the time, and everyone was shocked at the time. And for the first time in my memory, the right-wing crazies defeated the Republican leadership in the House and Senate and the White House and the entire coalition that traditionally supported the Republican Party. So they got bolder and they got more active, and they turned on John Boehner because he dared to negotiate a debt deal with the Democrats.
And we see that playing out right now with the latest speaker, Mike Johnson, just trying to cobble together something on Israel and Ukraine and so forth.
If you dare to compromise, which is absolutely necessary in a divided government, then you are evil and you're not a true conservative. Then the Tea Party emerged in like 2009. And there was another immigration reform fight. And they started to have these primaries and the Freedom Caucus, and it just built and built and built. But even up until 2012, we nominated Mitt Romney for president.
Right.
You and I, and we were still in charge,
Yeah.
I was the Republican nominee for the United States Senate in 2016. And during 2016, as I talk about in the book, I traveled all over the state of Washington, which is what you do when you're running statewide, as you know.
Yeah.
There were never Trump signs. You couldn't find a Trump supporter. The party's leadership, the activists, they were all with Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, some with Kasich. But then Trump got the nomination and he won all those primaries. And we realized while the party leadership was one way, the party's voters had changed and it all fell apart. But some people will tell you that the Republican Party has always been evil. Heather Cox Richardson, who I think is very smart and has written the book that people think is the definitional book about the Republican Party, argues that other than Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and Eisenhower, the Republican Party was always crap. And I just disagree with that.
Yeah. But I'm sorry that you cannot take that seriously, because then what does she say about the Democratic Party?
Nothing. Well, she loves them. I mean, she's a Democrat, I believe.
Right. So you just erase the first 100+ years of the Democratic Party You erased the birth of the Ku Klux Klan inside the Democratic Party, which, by the way, still exists to this day.
Mhm.
You disregard the fact that you had a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan serving in the United States Senate under Senator Byrd from West Virginia, Democrat. So this is where when you write stuff like that, and you just lead with such a partisan edge, you just become, in my view, unserious. I cannot take your thesis serious because you're not being serious in that moment.
Right, but the party began to really fall apart, deconstruct, as you said. In my mind, started with immigration around 2007, but it was a battle. We were holding on. There were primaries all over the place in terms of the Tea Party candidates back and forth. The Mike Lee primary in Utah, for instance. Our tribe, we were still doing okay, and then Trump came along, and then it just all completely collapsed.
But it collapsed. It collapsed spectacularly. And quickly.
Yes.
It wasn't like, okay, we're now, in day 3 of, Trump trying to take control of the party. He owns this thing. It happened like that. What was that all about? Was it just the collapse of the leadership, which I think played a big role in it, when the leadership capitulated because they were afraid of their own shadows? So this big burly orange-haired creature shows up in front of them. Mm-hmm. They don't know what to do with it. I can tell you the conversation I had with, folks at that time saying, we'll be able to manage Trump. And I was telling them, no, you won't. You don't understand what this man is. You won't be able to manage him. Mm-hmm. Boehner thought it. Ryan thought it. All of them thought it. And then when they tried, he just headbutted them out of the way.
Yeah, so like I said, I happened to be running for the U.S. Senate at the time, so I was right in the middle of it. I'm talking to my fellow candidates and the state party chairman, and first it was denial. He's not going to win,
right?
And if nothing else, we'll find a way to stop him at the convention. He's not going to be the nominee. Okay, he's the nominee. All right, well, we need to play nice, because we need the RNC's help for our other candidates. We need to keep the party united. So he'll lose. He's going to lose. This is critical. He's going to lose in November. And right. I believed that. I believed that he would lose in November of 2016, and I could help pick up the pieces and lead the party out of the wilderness. It was temporary, just like the Goldwater travesty was temporary.
Right.
Then he won. And then everything changed. And what I saw happen around me is a ton of my old friends just walked away. I'm going to go back to my law firm and make money.
Yep.
Or they bent the knee and became full MAGA. Or they tried to, and they still are doing this today, try and ignore him and say, oh, Chris, I'm going to try and elect some other good Republicans for the legislature or whatever. And I'm like, you cannot do that. This is the guy that defines the Republican Party. Michael, it has shocked me. It has shocked me that so few people like you and I, who led this party for a generation, have been unwilling to stand up and fight back.
Yeah, that's the part. That's the part for me that's so stunning, is the lack of fight. Mm-hmm. To deal with the threat inside the House. They're prepared to go barnstorm against Democrats all day long, but I'm sorry, the fire is in the basement. And sorry, it's on the main level now. Yeah, well, now it's consumed the whole house.
Yeah, it's just so strange, because there hasn't been a new party formed since 1854 that lasted. But it is common for there to be factions within parties, and they do right. battle all the time.
Right.
And it's obviously what should have happened is all the people who hate Trump should have formed together some sort of a faction, like the Clintons formed the New Democrats, right. Like Tony Blair formed New Labor, like the Tea Party.
Well, that's how Clinton defeated the progressives initially by the DLC. Yeah.
And it hasn't happened. And of course, that's what you and I are out yelling about, saying it needs to happen. It still has not happened. It's what has always happened in American politics in the past.
Well, what I want to do, I'm going to take a quick break. And when I come back, I want to open up that box, because there's a lot inside of that box that you and I have talked about and are working to animate. um, in this election cycle and beyond. So we want to get into that. We're having a great conversation with my man Chris Vance, former chairman of the state party, Republican Party of Washington. He is the author of the new book, The Fall of the Shining City: What Happened to the Republican Party, Why It Happened, and What Must Happen Now to Save American Democracy. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to get into how we mix this sucker up with Chris right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the Michael Steele podcast. I'm glad you can join us. Just sort of a little bit of a deep dive to party chairman inside the GOP, talking about how we save ourselves from ourselves. The book, The Fall of the Shining City, its author is Chris Vance. Chris, so you noticed, we were going to break, you talked about creating a faction, and you and I have had this debate for quite some time, making the case for a new party. You lay it out expertly in your book. I really want to open that up because I think there's a lot there that people don't know. There's a lot there that people presume. But more importantly, there's a lot there that we can do to sort of get that going. You note in the book, quote, "There is absolutely no reason why we must remain locked into the current party duopoly. Until relatively recently, our political parties were constantly splitting up, realigning, and reforming. The Federalist Party broke up and vanished after the War of 1812. The Democratic Party split over the leadership of Andrew Jackson and internal improvements, eventually creating the Whig Party. The Whigs broke up in the 1850s over the issue of slavery, and the Republican Party emerged. Republicans split in 1872 over Reconstruction, again in 1896 over the currency issue, and again in 1912. That tells you right now, we unstable as hell.
Sure. We used to be. We used to be.
Yeah, right. As the Bull Moose progressives followed Theodore Roosevelt out of the GOP. Southern Democrats split with their party over civil rights in 1948, 1960, and 1968 before ultimately migrating to the Republican Party. That is history. That is fact. That is what's occurred. Talk to us about the case for a new party in light of this history, and what that fight should look like.
Yeah. So after 2016, I have been in the wilderness running around trying to find, what's left of my fellow conservatives. I have dabbled in everything, in an independent movement. I was very briefly part of the Forward Party. But I in the end, I'm a conservative. I'm a Reaganite conservative. I'm not a moderate. I'm not a centrist. I'm not an independent, even though I ran for the state Senate as an independent against a hardcore MAGA Republican. But there's two choices, and only two choices. We can create a new party, or we can create a distinct branded faction within the Republican Party to fight for control of the Republican Party. I would go either way. If Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney and others said, we're forming a new party, we're going to have a convention and drop balloons and everything, I'll be there. You betcha. But I've come to believe that a faction is a better option, because it's really hard to explain to people what a party stands for. You've got ballot access problems, and just the American people don't believe there could be another party. Somehow they think that, like, God has come down and said, thou shalt only be two parties, and thy name shall be Republican and Democrat. So, but my God, creating a faction to fight within the Republican Party just makes so much sense. It should have happened a long time ago, and it would be relatively simple. A group of leaders need to form a PAC, file the paperwork to form a PAC, give it a name, and start raising money and engaging in political things. Find candidates to run in primaries. Find candidates in blue states to run against Democrats, and do battle at county conventions, state conventions, to take back the infrastructure of the state party. It may take a very long time, or it may happen very quickly. Things tend to shift. If If Trump loses this November, which I still think is the most likely outcome, there's going to be a lot of Republicans sick of losing. But this is what has to happen. Because I'll just say this. I mean, if Donald Trump passed from the scene today, the party wouldn't magically transform back.
No, it wouldn't.
I
No,
mean,
and I
the
think that's
base,
something, right, people don't understand. Yeah,
the base
it
is
would
so
not.
MAGAfied.
Right, exactly. So instead of just playing that out a little bit, instead of this idea of, creating a PAC and raising the money and run, MAGA didn't do that. MAGA just converted people. Is it possible to just convert them back, or to more importantly, get those who were once engaged to re-engage? In other words, come back into the fight. We hear the generals that are leading the fight. Here are the troops who are already armed and ready to go. Why doesn't that part of dealing with and creating that faction work versus something else?
That's a great point. MAGA took over the party the traditional way, from the top down. Every political party has been organized from the top down, not the bottom up, and united around a candidate.
Right.
Donald Trump, to his credit, give him credit, he had the guts to do it, ran for office, put himself out there, and he won. And that fact gave MAGA power. Now, that is one path for us. And I think maybe there's people thinking this way right now, which is, okay, let's beat Trump in 2024 and then run a normal, smart, good Reaganite Republican, there's lots of them out there, for president in 2028.
Right.
And by doing that, if we win, we take back control of the party. And there is a lot of truth in that. That might work. But
you got to get to that Republican primary.
Right. And that's why I think you've got to lay the groundwork by creating, a faction, a branded faction to take the party back. And as you said, we need some generals. We need some of the big leaders, the Liz Cheneys and the Mitt Romneys and the Kinsingers and the Pences and Christie, to step up and join this.
But will they? That's the problem. Isn't that at the end of the day? I mean, you're talking about individuals who did not grow up in the party. They weren't county chairmen. They weren't state party officials. They weren't political operatives in that sense. They decided, oh, I want to be on a ballot. They ran. They won. Right. They became the senator, the congressman. They be, the important person, and others did the work. With that lack of appreciation of the work, you don't appreciate the risk. You don't appreciate. They're not risk takers, in my view. Which is why this fight has been so lopsided. Which is why you have a Lindsey Graham and others sort of, oh, okay, well, I'll move off of John McCain and I'll move on to Trump. But he just called your boy McCain a bitch, right? He said he was a punk. He wasn't that's okay. No, he didn't really mean that. They start rationalizing because they don't have what it takes to actually lead that fight.
Right. So, more and more I'm thinking after Eisenhower took control. So again, critics think we've always been far right. They don't realize that, after the Great Depression, the people who led the Republican Party were Wendell Willkie, Tom Dewey, and Dwight Eisenhower, who were all liberals in the Republican Party. And the conservative base was really unhappy with this. So you had the William F. Buckley, Brent Bozell, all that crowd from the 1950s who created the conservative movement that you and I grew up with, the conservative movement. They, on their own, created an infrastructure of conservative activists who went out and agitated within the Republican Party, and then eventually united around the leadership of, not even the leadership, the candidacy of first Goldwater and then Reagan. And I think that's what go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so I want to put a pin in that because I think it's an important point, because that then ties back to the makeup of the Republican Party at the grassroots level. When I read through the evolution, the breaking up of one party or faction peeling off and creating something else. You had referenced earlier something very similar in that you had, as you noted in your book, you had the Southern Democrats split with their party over civil rights. So they were pissed about Kennedy embracing civil rights. Johnson finally did it, who was a redneck, good old boy, finally did. And they went, oh, hell no, we're out of here, which again led to why Kennedy went to Dallas in that fateful November of 1963 to show up the support he was losing among the political party at the base level. You had 48, 60, and 68 where the civil rights issues started pulling off white Southern men. So at that same time, you had Nixon making the calculation for his Southern strategy to get those men. William F. Buckley and others that you mentioned writing sort of a manifesto that appealed to that white Southern male conservative. So when you stop and think about the emergence of the conservative movement inside the GOP, it effectively took away or diminished the two pillars that we started our conversation on, which was national security, and the economy.
Right. They care way more about culture than those two issues.
And that's how we get where we are today.
Right. And so what we need to do now is, as you talked about, their base was disaffected white Southern men. The Republican Party used to be the party of college-educated suburbanites.
Right.
And Southern and rural conservatives.
Right.
We've lost the Southern, the Republic, the college-educated suburban voters. I think our new faction needs to be built around that. We need to go back and appeal to those people, the people who have shifted from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, even though they don't like having their taxes raised. They believe in capitalism, but the Republican positions on all social issues, and particularly Trump, are just abhorrent to them. And that has got to be the base of a new political movement. These disaffected suburban voters who right now are mostly voting for Democrats, but they don't really want to.
Right.
I saw that happen so much here in my state, where you have the affluent Microsoft, college-educated suburban voters around Seattle. Those districts used to be overwhelmingly Republican. Now the Republican Party doesn't even run candidates there. But those are the people that need to be the base for a new conservative or new political movement to retake the Republican Party, because they're sick of Trump, but they don't like Democrats, believe me.
Is that a shifting back to Reaganism? What does that look like? What does that look like philosophically, not just politically?
A modernized Reaganism, on today's issues. Reagan ran on specific issues. I mean, when he ran, the economy was not growing, and marginal tax rates were through the roof. That's not true today. I mean, Republicans don't need to cut taxes right now. In fact, they ought to be thinking about raising taxes on the rich to bring down the debt. But the basic pillars of strong national security, oppose Putin, stand against China, and grow the economy, that's what we should build around. But the world has changed. For instance, I mean, I can't imagine any political party is going to survive now that is staunchly pro-life. Just the American people won't have it in most states, especially in the states where we would have to. So it would have to be a reimagined, updated version of the basic core ideas of Reagan Bush Republicans, tailored to today's issues. And the country has changed.
So Chris, but here's the question: how do you then move those issues, immigration, abortion, what we've seen happening in the education space, what we've seen happen in other cultural components of our society, whether you're talking about gay and lesbian rights, you're talking about the emerging role of women in not just in terms of business, but now political power and other forms of power that they've been asserting. How do those issues align along with what you're seeing in terms of I don't know, I guess kind of the impact that we're seeing played out right now on abortion. And it's now so much part of the conversation. We are so far removed from economic and national security issues.
Right. Well, I think that when you actually look at it, the vast majority of the American people agree on immigration. They do. It's the far right and the far left which make it so hard. I mean, most Americans want the border secure. Nobody should come in this country illegally, but they don't want to deport 11 million people who are already here.
Right.
And they have compassion for asylum seekers. It's only the extremists that stop it. And I think that's true on most every issue. Most Americans do not support abortion at any time for any reason, but they also think that abortion should be accessible for those who need it. And it's a really hard issue to talk about. But also the overwhelming majority of Americans support gay marriage.
Right.
They support transgender rights. They didn't in the old days. I mean, when I was state party chairman, if the Democrats dared to just put a sentence in their platform about same-sex marriage, we called them the crazy loony left. I mean, this country has moved culturally so much,
and that's what the heart of the fight is about among these MAGA conservatives. That's actually just MAGA Republicans, because it's not conservatism in the sense that
the key thing to remember, I think you got to factor in the Democrats.
Right.
I think the only thing propping up the Democrats is Donald Trump. They have so alienated the middle class and suburban voters with really high gas prices, particularly in my state,
right,
and more than anything, and taxes and crime.
Right.
Crime. There's a general sense that Democrats tolerate disorder and crime, and that is just fatal to them. So we would need to have a movement that says to people, we're going to keep you safe from the Russians, the Chinese, and criminals. We're going to grow the economy. We're going to be moderate and tolerant on social issues. To sum it all up, I can't count the number of times people would call me when I was chairman and say, Chris, I would really support Republicans if because I agree with you on taxes and spending and defense. If you just get out of my bedroom.
Right. I've heard that a lot.
Yeah, right. It's the moderate, fiscally conservative, socially moderate party that people say is a unicorn and can never exist.
Right.
Well, I think if it did exist, it would sweep the field.
So, I think we find ourselves now at a point where we kind of look at the bigger picture, laying out the history, understanding how we got here, seeing what the options and the strategies could be to create a faction, disrupt the menace, if you will. How do you see the party going forward? Let's say these things start to happen. They happen slowly. 24, Trump loses. I think he does lose this election, despite what we're seeing even today. But there's still the matter of the party. There's still the remnants of Trumpism, which will not go away in a cycle. How do you see it playing out? What force do you think needs to be brought to bear now to set in motion the very things you're talking about?
Well, if Trump is reelected, first of all, a lot of people will then just roll their eyes, say, I give up. I'm going to Canada or whatever. We can't do that.
Right.
We have to continue to fight, but it will be horribly ugly and awful. Let's assume he loses. There will be a lot of Republicans, even more than before, who are like, enough. Because you assume if he's losing, they're losing seats in Congress, they're losing governorships.
Right.
Then the door will open a little bit to reconsider our ideas. But the problem is, this is one thing people have gotten wrong about Donald Trump from the beginning. There is the element that it's a cult of personality, and it's about what he says, but there is also an intellectual underpinning to this.
Yes.
There are literally think tanks and universities who promote this right-wing nationalism.
I mean, exactly. Think about what's happened with Heritage. I mean, that's exactly your point about how even among the intellectuals now, they have a think tank that is actually out there promoting this stuff.
Claremont, lots of them talking about how we need a red Caesar, instead of democracy, there's a lot of, unfortunately, I'm Catholic, I know you are, There's a lot of right-wing Catholics who are out there saying we need, a theocracy based on the leadership of the church, so that's not going to go away. And the base is now, which is the base voters, is not, they're heavily invested in these issues. And so are now the activists, the party leaders, where by that I mean they are not going to suddenly change their position on what I call the big three: immigration, protectionism, being against free trade, and isolationism.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not going to change their position. So they have to be defeated.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I became state party chairman because I ran and beat someone. I assume you did too.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And that's what we have to do, because I'm convinced there are people who are not currently in the Republican base and are not currently activist Republicans who would rally. Maybe they're former Republicans. Maybe they left the party a long time ago, who would rally to our cause if we get in the fight. You can't beat somebody with nobody.
Right.
I'm very ambivalent about how I feel about Nikki Haley, but she fought.
Yeah.
She got 20, 25, 30% of the vote, and that makes a difference. So if we don't engage, the party's going to continue to be Trumpy MAGA terrors. But if we get in the fight, we have a chance, especially if they lose badly in 24, to turn this thing around. And ultimately, maybe the greatest thing that could happen to American democracy is the party reverts to its Reaganite leadership, and the Trumpers do what they've threatened to do over and over again. They leave,
right,
and form an America First party, which they have threatened to do. And I was like, please.
Yeah.
What should really happen?
Ticket.
Well, what should really happen in America is the AOC left-wing Democrats should form a Democratic Socialist Party, and the Trumpers should form a nationalist pseudo-fascist party, and the Republicans and Democrats should govern from the middle. We should have 4 parties.
Yeah.
But we can't control that. But what we can control is whether or not we choose to stand up and fight for the party of Reagan and Teddy Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan.
There it is. Chris Vance. I knew this would be a good conversation, man. I appreciate you very much laying it out. The fall of the shining city, what happened to the Republican Party, why it happened, and what must happen now to save American democracy.
Appreciate you can get it on Amazon.com.
Amazon.com. Get it, folks. It's a good read if you want to understand not just the how and the why, but what needs to be done going forward. I appreciate Chris Vance. Thanks, Brian, for coming on. I really, really appreciate this conversation.
I am honored.
Absolutely. Well, folks, that does it for our time together. Love it when you come and spend some time with me and my guests. I hope you got something out of this. Please share and like this with your friends. Let them know that there's a conversation that they can sort of dial into and get just a little bit of an understanding, a better understanding of what's happening inside of my party and Chris's party, and the book. Please pick up a copy. Trust me, you will enjoy it. The Fall of the Shining City by Chris Vance. It's out now. Get it on Amazon. Follow Chris on Twitter, X, whatever the hell it's called today, at Chris Vance 123. And certainly do your voodoo with me here with the podcast at Michael Steele, at podcast at Steele _ podcast, and do that download thing. Love you. Take care, y'all. Until next time.